Story 1. Cell number 13. I never believed the stories about cell number 13. When I was first thrown in here, the other inmates warned me. They said anyone who slept in this cell would start hearing whispers at night. Some claimed to have seen strange shadows in the corner of the room. But to me, it was all just nonsense meant to scare new prisoners. The first night went by normally. This prison was already terrifying enough without ghost stories. The creaking metal, the guards' footsteps, and the murmurs from other cells made the atmosphere unsettling. But as I started to drift off, something woke me up. A whisper. I froze. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Wake up." I swallowed hard and glanced toward the corner. Nothing was there, just the shadow of the iron bars stretching across the floor. Yet, I felt something watching me. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. But suddenly, my bed shook, as if something underneath was trying to pull it. I jumped up, looking at the floor. There were long scratch marks, like claw marks. I wanted to scream, but my voice got stuck in my throat. Then, I felt it. Something was behind me. Warm breath brushed against the back of my neck, and that voice whispered again, "You're in my place." I screamed and ran to the bars, shaking them violently. A guard rushed over, looking annoyed. "What the hell are you yelling about at this hour?" There's something in here," I stammered. The guard chuckled and shook his head. "Yeah, I figured. Cell number 13 loves playing with its residents." I stood there, breathing heavily. That's when it hit me. This cell had been empty before I came in, and maybe it was supposed to stay that way. Story 2. The figure behind the bars. I've been in this prison for 5 years. I thought I had grown used to all the sounds that haunted the nights here. The screams of inmates, the dragging of chains, the heavy footsteps of the guards. But there was one thing that always sent shivers down my spine. The figure behind the bars. Every night, exactly at 3 o'clock, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing in the corridor, motionless, just watching. I never saw its face clearly. The dim prison lights only provided enough glow to outline its tall, thin frame. Tonight, I tried to ignore it. I pulled my blanket over myself, turning away, forcing myself to sleep. But then, that feeling returned. The feeling of being watched. Slowly, I turned toward the bars. The figure was still there, but this time closer. My heart pounded. I knew this corridor was heavily guarded. No inmate could be out at this hour. I sat up, moving toward the bars, trying to get a clearer look. When I blinked, it was even closer. I stumbled backward. The figure was now only a few steps from my cell. I could see its face, or what was left of it. The skin didn't seem to fit right, like something underneath was trying to break free. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then, in an instant, it vanished. I stood there, panting, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. From the end of the corridor, I heard heavy breathing, and I knew it would come again tomorrow night. Story 3. Whispers in the locked cell. This prison has one rule that is always followed. Never go near the cell at the end of Block D. It's the only cell that remains locked at all times, even though no one is inside. People here call it the empty cell, but every inmate knows it's not truly empty. I first noticed something strange on my first night in Block D. When all the inmates were asleep, whispers started coming from that cell. They were soft, barely audible, like someone reciting a prayer in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I stayed here, the louder the whispers became. Tonight, I was woken up by a noise. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a painful moan, like someone suffering. I sat up and walked to my bars, staring toward the locked cell. Its door was slightly open. My heart pounded. That was impossible. The guards always made sure it was sealed tight. Holding my breath, I tried to see inside. Darkness. Pure, impenetrable darkness, as if light couldn't reach in. Then, something moved. A hand, thin, unnaturally long, crawled out from the blackness. Its nails were sharp and blackened. I froze. Then, a voice, no longer a whisper, but a raspy, guttural tone. "Help me, come inside." I stumbled backward, my breathing ragged. My hands shook as I gripped the bars. I wanted to scream, but my voice refused to come out. Suddenly, the cell door slammed shut. The next morning, I worked up the courage to ask a guard, "What's inside that cell?" I asked. The guard stared at me for a long time before answering, "Not what, but who." I shivered. "He was an inmate," the guard continued, "but one night, he vanished. No one knows where he went. All we know is, the whispers started after that." I swallowed hard. One thing was clear. Whatever was inside that cell, it was still waiting for someone to enter, and I had almost been that person. Story 4: The Windowless Prison. I was sentenced to 25 years and sent to this prison without much consideration. No lengthy trial, no real defense, just a quick verdict that landed me in this place. A massive, decrepit prison in the middle of the desert, its towering walls swallowing every bit of light. I didn't notice anything strange at first, but when I was led into my cell, something felt off. There were no windows. Not in the hallway, not in my cell, nowhere. Just 4 rough stone walls and iron bars facing a narrow corridor. The first few days passed uneventfully, but on my 5th night, I realized something was terribly wrong. I woke up to a noise. Not the usual sounds of prison life. Not the guards. Not the distant murmurs of inmates. It was footsteps, coming from inside my wall. I sat up slowly, pressing my ear against the cold stone. Footsteps, pacing back and forth. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. There wasn't supposed to be anything behind that wall. It was just solid stone, but something was in there. Something that moved. I tried to ignore it, but the next night, it got worse. Not just footsteps this time, breathing. Ragged, heavy breathing, just behind the wall. I stayed awake all night, pressing my back against the opposite side of the cell, refusing to get near that wall again. I was losing my mind, but I couldn't tell anyone. Then, on the 10th night, I made a mistake. I sat on the floor, staring at the wall, fear gnawing at my sanity. I couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, I reached out, running my fingers along the rough surface. That's when I felt it. A crack, almost invisible. I swallowed hard. There was something behind this wall. Slowly, I pressed against the crack, hoping it was just my imagination. But suddenly, the stone shifted. A tiny opening appeared, just big enough to peek through. My throat went dry. I didn't want to know what was inside. But my body moved on its own, my curiosity overpowering my fear. I leaned in, pressing my eye against the gap. Darkness. I squinted, trying to see deeper. Then, something moved inside. A face. Not fully visible, but I knew it was a face. And it was staring right back at me. Its eyes were hollow, void of life. Its skin was pale, almost rotten, as if it had been trapped inside that wall for decades. I stumbled backward, falling onto the floor. The crack suddenly sealed itself, as if the wall had never shifted. I gasped for breath, cold sweat dripping down my skin. I wanted to scream, but at that moment, I realized the breathing was now coming from inside my cell, and I was no longer alone. Story 5, Cell 34. The one who used to live here. This prison has stood for over 100 years. Its walls are covered in old carvings, and the floors always feel damp, even though we're in the middle of a desert. When I was first brought to my cell, the guard escorting me seemed reluctant to stop at the door. He simply unlocked the bars and walked away quickly, as if he didn't want to linger. My cell number, 34. At first, nothing seemed strange. Just a small space with an old metal bed, a toilet in the corner, and stone walls covered in deep scratch marks. No windows, just iron bars separating me from the dimly lit hallway. I first noticed something strange on my first night. As I lay in bed, I heard a faint sound coming from beneath the floor. A slow, deliberate scratching. I thought it was rats, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded like fingers. I tried to ignore it, but the next night, something worse happened. I woke up to a presence at the foot of my bed. I didn't look immediately. My breath hitched, my body frozen. I felt someone standing there. Slowly, I glanced over. Nothing, but something had changed. My cell door, which should have been locked, was slightly open. I sat up, staring at the hallway. It was dark and empty. The guards usually patrolled every hour, but tonight, there were no footsteps. I tried to go back to sleep, assuming the guard had forgotten to lock it. But as I lay down, I felt something that made my blood run cold. The mattress dipped slightly, like someone had just lain down beside me. I bolted upright, hitting the wall behind me, my body trembling. There was no one there, but I could feel the presence stronger than before. I ran to the bars, shaking them, trying to scream for help, and then I heard a whisper, a deep, raspy voice, right behind me. "Why are you sleeping in my bed?" I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there, shaking. Then, in the faint reflection on the iron bars, I saw it. Someone was behind me. He was skeletal, with sickly greenish skin, hollow eyes like black holes. His prison uniform was tattered, and in his hands, he clutched a blood-stained cloth. I spun around, but he was gone. My cell door suddenly slammed shut with a loud click. The next morning, I asked an old inmate about cell 34. He just stared at me, his face pale. "Someone used to live there," he said, "but he disappeared. They never found his body, just blood on the walls." I swallowed hard. Since that night, I started sleeping on the floor, far from the bed. But every night, I still feel the mattress sink, like someone is still lying there.